1 p.m.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to our webinar on amalgamation. And my name's Emily Hill. I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Canadian Ministries here in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. You may be here live with us, or you might be watching this afterwards. In either case, we strongly welcome you, and we thank you that you're showing such an interest in amalgamation and what this ministry configuration could mean for your congregation or for the congregations in your presbytery or your area. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, so we like to make people aware of that. The participants who join us in the session will be on mute, so you will notice that you won't be able to kind of talk or show your webcam, but I would encourage any questions that you have, please put them through the chat function. Just type them into the chat, which you can find in your in the GoToMeeting sort of console under the little talk bubble, and you can ask any questions at any time, and I will moderate. I'll keep track of them, and then Heather will be leaving time at the end for people to ask questions, and I'll bring those to her. And yeah, so now I'm going to turn it over to Heather with a little introduction. So the Reverend Dr. Heather Melnick is going to be speaking to us based on an experience she had with the Church of Living Faith Church, Presbyterian Church in Baxter, Ontario. And she's speaking to us from journeying with that congregation through amalgamation. She has recently moved to a new call at Knox Presbyterian in Bracebridge, Ontario. So welcome, Heather, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We always love it when you know, our ministry leaders agree to help us out in this way and to share their experience, because it really is meaningful to the church to hear from others who have on the ground experience in various ministry configurations. So thank you so much, Heather.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here with you and with those who will be listening later on, just to share our experience at Living Faith Community Presbyterian Church and what we went through, sort of with the caveat that what worked for one might not work for others, but hopefully by sharing our experience, you'll have an idea of what did work for us, and maybe you can adapt that to your own situation. So a little bit of an introduction about myself. As Emily said, I recently moved just in early October up to Bracebridge to a new call, but I journeyed with the Living Faith congregation in its prior form and in its Living Faith form for 23 years. So we spent a wonderful time together, a time of lots of change and growth and experimentation. And I really felt very blessed to be part of that community. I'll tell you a little bit about the Living Faith story, what led what is now called Living Faith Community Presbyterian Church, because we certainly didn't start that way. We were a rural 3-point charge when I first got involved with the congregation, and my involvement started in 1993 when my family and I moved back to Ontario after living in Quebec and New Brunswick. My husband recently retired from the RCMP, and so we moved around with his work. And so when I moved back and we ended up settling in Baxter, I became a member of Baxter Presbyterian Church. And so at that time, we were a 3-point charge, Baxter, Ivy, and Cookstown Presbyterian churches. We had a very innovative, far-thinking, visionary minister at that time who was the Reverend Carol Smith. And we recognized that current system of 3 rural charges, having services all on a Sunday morning, with one minister leading those 3 churches was just not sustainable. And we'd sort of gone into a maintenance mode instead of being mission focused and mission minded. And like many, we were declining financially, numerically, we were aging, and our buildings were a big problem as well. The church that I was sort of centered in, Baxter Presbyterian Church, was probably the smallest of the 3 and the least well equipped of the 3. So we recognized that we needed to change. If we were truly to be missional, mission-minded, community-minded, really being the hands and feet of Christ in our community, we couldn't continue on the way we were. In fact, the Baxter Church, I remember the treasurer standing up one Sunday and saying that we could sustain ourselves for about 6 more months. And after that, we wouldn't be able to pay our portion of the expenses anymore. And sometimes when your backs are against the wall, it makes you think a little bit more creatively and gives you some impetus to try something new. So I'd like to share with you the process that did eventually lead to amalgamation. So it definitely was a process, and it took place over several years, and we tried some different options before we finally did amalgamate. And so things don't really happen haphazardly. There really has to be a plan, and there has to be some intentional visioning. So when we came to this realization that we really weren't sustainable in this 3-point configuration, we formed a growth committee, and we had 2 people from each of our 3 congregations, Baxter, Ivy, Cookstown, commit to joining this growth committee. And we met once a month. And now we're not creative enough to come up with our own sort of visioning strategy on our own. So we used curriculum, and we used Ken and Callahan's 12 Keys to an Effective Church. And so every month we had a different chapter, and the way we did it is that every person from the growth committee was responsible for their own chapter. So it wasn't too cumbersome for the participants. They didn't have to read the whole curriculum, but they really did have to know their chapter. And then they would present it to the rest of the growth committee on their specific month. And, you know, I would say we were about 3/4 of the way through this process. So maybe 7 or 8 months into the process when we had an aha moment, when it sort of, the shoe fell, the penny dropped, and we realized, you know, we would be much more effective if we worked together instead of each of our 3 congregations trying to replicate, trying to do things individually in their own specific communities. And so we decided at that point, that would have been around 1999, we decided at that point to form regional ministry. So we actually were successful in getting some funding from what was called Canada Ministries at that time, Canadian Ministries. And we started being intentionally working together. So we formed a ministry team. And that's when I came on staff in a paid position. I was hired as the Christian Ed consultant. We had our ordained minister, Carol Smith. We also, through the funding, hired a pastoral care coordinator and an administrative assistant. And so we formed this team approach to caring for the 3 congregations in our, that were formerly the 3-point charge. Now we called ourselves the Good News Presbyterian Cluster. That started January 1st of 2000. We wouldn't use that wording now, we would call it the Good News Regional Ministry. And so we shared all of those ministry opportunities with this team ministering to the 3 congregations. And that really got us into the habit and really the blessing of doing things together. We also started worshiping together once a month. We held an evening service. And this was an opportunity for us to experiment with some more worship styles that perhaps we're more free to do that in an evening service, and we might be a bit hesitant to include in the morning worship. But I can remember when we started hearing people say, we should sing that song on Sunday morning, then we knew it was safe to start making that change. We shared the pastoral care. We shared the youth and children's ministry. That was my responsibility. And we sort of existed that way for 3 years. But during that 3-year process, we had another aha moment. And it took about 3 years for us to get there. We realized that this permeation, this regional ministry would only get us so far. we still had our buildings that were real hindrances to us. The Baxter building, the Baxter Church, was in the best location. It was right across the street from an elementary school. So we had a lot of children's and youth ministry out of that building. But out of the three, it was the worst when it came to being equipped. I remember we didn't even have hot running water. We didn't have a phone, and we had terrible reception in Baxter at that time. And we also had flooding issues with the building. It flooded at least twice a year. So of course that ends up leading to mold and just the cleanup and smell. It was not great. The Cookstown congregation as well, that building was limiting. It too had flooding issues, and there was no parking at all. So 3 years into this regional ministry configuration, 2 of our congregations made a decision to amalgamate. Now, everybody always asks what happened to the third. And so Ivy decided they wanted to stay on their own, which they did with our blessing. And I can remember our minister at that time, Carol Smith, saying it was almost like having a child go off to university, the way we felt about it. There was no animosity. They continued on their own, and we supported them by attending some of their special events, and they would attend ours. But Cookstown and Baxter decided, you know, these buildings are really hindering what the ministry that we feel God is calling us to. So let's take this bold step. We will sell our buildings. We will meet in neutral space, and then we will build a new church. And we did all those things. It took time, but we did build our new church in 2007, and we held our first worship service in our new house of worship on Thanksgiving Sunday 2007, which I always thought was quite significant. Now, Ivy is still on its own. It's under the care of an interim moderator with very strong lay leadership, and they do have some regular preachers who will fill the pulpit for them. And I would say they are growing. So for them, staying on their own was a good decision. And I would venture to say that they are almost getting strong enough that they could consider half-time ministry. So, you know, from this amalgamation, it wasn't the answer for all of our churches. It was definitely the answer for 2 of them, though. Just to tell you a little bit, I've done a really quick overview of what brought us to Living Faith. I will backtrack and explain some of the details going forward, but just to explain to you who Living Faith is today. So that's a picture. Actually, it's a guy that plows the parking lot there, who was driving by and saw the rainbow over the church and took that picture and sent it to me. And that's where we are. You can see the little former Baxter Presbyterian Church in the background there. And we're located right in the small community of Baxter. And you see the land to the right, that is actually being developed right now and will be subdivision sometime soon, with about 250 homes in it. So the community of Baxter is really going to change, and I know Living Faith has been doing some work to prepare for that. We deliberately chose the word community when we came to renaming the congregation, the new congregation. And Living Faith Community Presbyterian Church has truly become a community church. It is used very frequently by community groups. Again, this year, we're going to be hosting the inauguration for the newly elected Township Council, and I believe that will be the 3rd time. And so it's wonderful to see a space that is accessible, fully accessible, and is used quite frequently by the community. Average worship on a Sunday now is anywhere between 90 and 120. Back when we were considering amalgamation, I'd say at the Baxter Church it was 12 or 15, and Cookstown was stronger. It would be between 30 and 50. So we have been steadily growing. like I said, we're across the street from an elementary school, so we do have a lot of young families, just because that's the community in which we find ourselves. Living Faith today has also made a great commitment to refugee sponsorship. So we have sponsored 2 refugees from Zimbabwe, and a third has joined us who was from Zimbabwe but came to us from Toronto, and they are now planning to sponsor 5 more refugees. And our refugee friends have become just wonderful members of the community, of the congregation, and have really been a blessing to us. For the first time in a long time, finances are strong. The mortgage is almost paid, and they are very committed to mission, community, global, national mission commitments. There is a messy church that is held the last Thursday of every month. There's a weekly after school club that actually started in that little Baxter Presbyterian Church in 1999. We've also introduced a special needs ministry at Living Faith. We just noticed that a lot of our children were coming to us with some exceptionalities, a lot of them on the autism spectrum, and I went back to school and did a lot of work when it comes to sharing faith with children with autism. So again, with some support from the National Church, we actually started a sensory room, a space in the church with paid staff that is able to man that room. So when our children are becoming overwhelmed, and not just kids with a defined special need, but any child becoming overwhelmed in the regular classroom or the regular programming, we have the special needs room where they can go and still be ministered to, but in a setting that is more comforting to them. So I'm just going to back up a little bit and tell you how we got to become who we are today as Living Faith. So I often get calls from people who will ask me, okay, so you guys built a new church. How did you do it? And they're asking me about the bricks and mortar, like how do you go about fundraising? How do you get the permits? Who do you hire as a contractor? Who do you get to do this? And my first response is always, so what type of ministry is God calling you to? Who is God calling you to be? Who is your congregation called to serve? Because long gone is the day of build it and they will come. They have to come for a reason nowadays. And it's so that piece of intentional planning, intentional visioning, strategic planning is so important before any type of amalgamation or building project can go ahead, I believe. We need to know who we are, who God is calling us to be, before we can know what we're going to look like. For us at Living Faith, the building was crafted specifically for ministry with children, young families. There's a big hall that is also a gym. There's quite a large children's ministry wing. But I always say that building would look very different if we were located, say, across the street from a hospital or a senior's home. It really depends on your neighborhood and who God is calling you to reach. And I used to call it community needs evangelism, but evangelism sort of is a word that's been co-opted and used in different ways that are not much appreciated. So I now try to call it community needs outreach. So when it comes to community needs outreach, there's some homework really that congregations need to do. And if you are considering amalgamation with another neighboring congregation, could be from the same denomination or a complementary denomination, we can talk a little bit about that in a minute, then I would really encourage you that when you do that strategic planning, that you come together, leaders from both, or how many congregations there are, come together and do some of this homework, discovering who your neighbors are, what are their needs, and then you will have an idea of what your ministry is going to look like. So like I said, Living Faith has a strong, thriving, healthy ministry for families and young children because that's where we're located, in a community with families and young children. but where you are may be very different. So you need to know who are your neighbors, what are the needs of your neighbors, and how can you, as the Church of Jesus Christ, meet those needs. And those needs can be practical, they can be emotional, and they can also be, of course, spiritual. So when you discover who your neighbors truly are, and I would suggest that you use demographic studies from your municipality, that you visit the Stats Can website. They've got all sorts of wonderful demographic information on there. And then you just sort of go out into the community and get to know the people. And you find out what their real needs are, and then have fun doing some visioning and dreaming about how you can meet those needs in a creative way. So some of the needs that your communities may be facing are homelessness, poverty, children coming home alone. So that's really what we noticed in Baxter, that there were lots of kids coming home after school. And I knew that there were no parents home at that time because they were still at work. And so that's why we started the after school club. Now, things have changed since I've moved up to Bracebridge. I'm discovering that loneliness is actually an issue here. There are quite a few people who came up perhaps to Bracebridge to retire and might be a bit older. Maybe they've lost a loved one, their spouse in the past years, and so loneliness is an issue. So we're just starting a new ministry here to address that felt need in our community. And so perhaps finding that need in your community, dreaming about how you can meet that need, that then becomes your mission, your vision for this amalgamated ministry. And that could be the vision that drives your amalgamation process, giving you an idea of what it's actually going to look like. Now, I would have to say, the driving force behind some of our amalgamation projects might not be so lofty or positive or angelic sounding. Unfortunately, in our climate these days, amalgamation projects may indeed be spearheaded out of desperation and necessity as a means to make ends meet, to keep ministry going, perhaps even an experiment before closing the doors. And honestly, that's where we were, to be completely honest. As I mentioned, Baxter was in dire straits financially. And so, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't really have a problem with what is the motivating factor that's driving the amalgamation project, because sometimes we need to be in a state of desperation before we will consider new and radical things that look greatly different from what we're used to. I've often said sometimes when our backs are against the wall, we become much more willing to be creative and try something new. And I truly believe that God meets us in that place of desperation and gives us hope. When our backs are up against the wall and we don't know how we're going to go forward, that's maybe where God shows God's self, and he challenges us to be bold and courageous, to try something new. And then we watch what God can do when we make ourselves vulnerable, relying completely on God's guidance and wisdom. We always said, we had no idea how to go about a building project, let alone amalgamation. None of us in the congregation had any experience with that. And I think when you just let yourself be led completely by God, because you don't have the gifts or the skills on your own, God does show up and God does lead you on a very amazing journey. Now, there are definitely some practical things to keep in mind, though. We rely completely on God, and we have faith and trust in God's guidance, but we do have to make some practical decisions ourselves as a congregation, too. So I've sort of come up with a list of some important things to consider when you are embarking on an amalgamation project. And I sort of came up with this because we got lots of great guidance and help ourselves. We had consultants come in and meet with us. We had joint session meetings. That growth committee sort of formed into the new church development committee, and we had Keith Boyer come and do some work with us. We had Neil Mathers, who had been through an amalgamation project himself with his congregation, come and lead sessions with us. And so they did have some practical points for us to consider. And I've just sort of gathered some of those that were really helpful for us in our amalgamation project. So the first point is not always possible for every congregation. For us, it was possible. But discover new neutral space in which to worship. Now, that meant for us selling our buildings. We sold the two churches. We also sold the manse. And with permission from the presbytery, we were able to keep those funds and designate them for our future building project. So we did get about half or a bit over half of the money needed to build the new building from the sale of our former buildings. And then we worshiped together. What we thought was going to be 2 years in our long range planning ended up being 4 years, worshiping in the local school, that school that is located across the street from Living Faith. And we found that we grew quite a bit when we were worshiping in the school. Sometimes those of us in church world don't realize how intimidating it is for a new person to walk into our buildings, our old traditional church buildings on a Sunday morning. And some of the things that hinder people are they just don't want to sit in somebody's spot. They don't know if they're going to know anybody. But that neutral space in the school was a time of great growth for us because people don't have any qualms about entering into a public space, the public school. They're there through the week with their kids, so they knew exactly where they were going when they came in on Sunday morning. And it's ideal if you can find worship space that doesn't have any connection to the prior congregations. Now that I know that that's not always possible, it's not always feasible to find this neutral new space. We were fortunate to have the school. Now we did look at the Lions Hall, we looked at an arena at one point. Turned out that the school was our best choice, but some congregations don't have that. So if you are worshiping in one or the other of the amalgamating congregations in one of those churches, I would work really hard at trying to make it neutral space, bringing in some of the elements, some of the furniture from the congregation that is joining, so that it doesn't feel sort of like a merger or a takeover, that it is equal space with both congregations being recognized and honored. We used to joke by calling ourselves Backstown and Cookster for a while. So that leads to the second point of creating a new name for the amalgamated congregation. And we held a contest. The session oversaw a contest, and we had members of the congregation participate, and that's how we came up with Living Faith Community Presbyterian Church. The other part is this discernment process. So that's what I was talking about earlier. We use the 12 keys to an effective church, Ken and Callahan. There's other material out there as well. But I would really encourage amalgamating congregations to engage in this intentional discernment process to discover who God's calling you to be, who God is calling you to serve, your neighborhood, and what is your new identity? What will you look like? And you know, you can do planning up to a certain point, and then you just have to do it. And then through those initial months and years, you discover together your identity. But I think it goes much more smoothly when you've done some of that homework ahead of time. And that's sort of that community evangelism, community outreach piece that I mentioned. One thing I didn't say, when we were getting the information from StatsCan and from demographic studies from the municipality, we also engaged in a community survey. So we created surveys that we delivered to every home. We didn't knock on on doors and engage with people that way, because that can be annoying, we know. So we just left the packages. That was a while back. Now I would say do one of those monkey surveys or some sort of online survey. You can do it through Facebook, I think, as well. And just find out who are your neighbors and what do they need. And we even asked questions like, in an ideal world, what would you want to see from your local church? And they answered those questions. And that's how we started the after school club, when we realized that after school care was a real need. And of course, pray. Ken and Callahan's resources are wonderful because they're surrounded in scripture and in prayer. So every time you meet, there is prayer and there is scripture that is involved as well. There's also some real practical elements to consider when involved in the amalgamation process. So this is what I'm calling the legal stuff. So we love to do things by committee in the Presbyterian Church, but this is when I think that's really helpful. What we did with the Baxter and Cookstown congregations, they created a basis of union. So it was some key people, key leaders from the congregation, including the minister, who worked together to draft this basis of union. And we just covered everything, like what items are going to come into the new agreement, where we're going to meet, who's going to do what the leadership is going to look like. We merged a lot of our separate groups, like the ladies group and the Bible studies, the board of managers, and also the session. And this was probably the most important thing. In our basis of union, we brought both sessions together. Nobody left at that point. And every elder committed to stay with the session, to maintain their position of leadership until 1 year after the new building was up and ministry was taking place. And I think that was the best decision that was made, because it made for consistent leadership. We weren't having new people. We adopted term leadership, but we canceled that at that point. We stayed consistent for that time that we were worshiping in the school up until a year after we were in our new location. And it just meant that the leadership knew exactly where we had been, where we were going. They were part of the visioning process, and they provided that consistent leadership. And then after that year, we held an elder election, and some went off, and then some new people came on board. Also, of course, through all of this, you need to have involvement from the congregation, from all the congregations involved in your amalgamation. So we held several joint congregational meetings. We found that communication was so important, because there's fear and there's worry and there's stress about what it's going to look like. Are we going to lose this? Who's going to do what? Who's going to be the organist? Who's going to be the leader? And so consistent and regular communication with the congregation and encouraging their involvement. And so we did hold dinners and worship services and dessert nights where we all came together, and they were part of the planning process, hopefully at every step of the way. And it was really the congregation led by the session with their feedback that drove the process. So I would really encourage transparent, consistent, and regular communication in whatever format works best for you. And then when it comes to the vote, we held separate votes. So the Baxter congregation voted apart from the Cookstown congregation. And that way people could speak honestly and share any concerns without having to worry about offending anybody. Also, I would encourage you, when it comes to vote time, that the session would pass a motion saying, what percentage of the result are you going to be happy with? We wouldn't have been happy if the vote was 51% in favor of amalgamation. And we, if I'm remembering correctly, we made it 75%. If the vote was going to be less than 75%, then we wouldn't go ahead, not meaning never, but we knew we needed to do some more homework before we went there. So that's an important piece of the process, is making sure that you have a high percentage of your congregation that is in favor. And then, of course, you need to take it to presbytery to get their approvals as well. And I would suggest that you craft sort of a slick presentation to presbytery. We found that the majority of the questions that they asked us were financial in nature, so make sure you've got a budget, and make sure you've worked out sort of a vision going forward of what it's going to look like financially, and also when it comes to mission and what your ministry is going to look like. And I would also have something for you to consider, an invitation. Even though, or even if you think that your congregation or congregations don't have the energy, the desire, or the willingness to try something new, I would invite you to go through the process of revisioning anyway, using a curriculum such as the 12 Keys to an Effective Church. Because to be completely honest, I was part of the ministry team at this time. I wasn't the ordained clergy. I wasn't ordained until 06. So we had been worshiping in the school for just over 2.5 years around by that point. And when this idea of amalgamation between Baxter and Cookstown first was shared with me, I thought, no way are these congregations going to go for it. I thought Cookstown was fairly healthy at that point. They aren't going to want to connect with Baxter with all its financial problems. And to be completely honest, at that point, I thought Baxter really just wanted to close. They were tired and they really just wanted to let it go. However, we started this process of visioning and going through the 12 keys, and then getting excited about what God was doing in our midst and where God was calling us to go. And it really reinvigorated both of those congregations. And I think just going through the process allowed us to see the possibilities before us. And then we started to see that it was actually possible for us. So I believe, again, us with our love of committees and meetings, I believe that God used that process to infuse us with renewed energy, vision, and hope, just to see where God was leading us into the future. And that hope had not been present among us for a long time while we were in this maintenance mode. And you know, when there's hope, there's opportunity. There's opportunity for growth, for new things, and for new ways of being the church that God has called us to be. So next steps. I've shared an awful lot of information with you. How you go about initiating the process with your congregations really depends on your context. I do have perhaps a suggestion. As Ken and Callahan would say, have fun, whatever you decide to do, however you decide to share this information or explore this information, have fun doing it. And one thing that we used more than once, because it is fun, is we had dessert and dreaming nights. So we would get together, and whenever there's dessert involved, you know, people are going to come out to it. And I have included in the handout just sort of a guideline of a way that you could craft a dessert and dreaming night. And it was a way for people to come out to have fun, but also have their opportunity to be heard, to share their ideas and their dreams for the future, and to collaboratively, in a fun way, involving sugar, to discover where God is guiding you. And you know, we did a dessert and dreaming night not that long ago at Living Faith, because after being in our building for 10 years, we realized we were running out of space, and our children's ministry had grown so much that we needed more space. So we pulled out that dessert and dreaming idea again and held another one, and that's where we came up with our idea of expansion onto the building to house our growing children's ministry. So that was our journey. That's what amalgamation looked like for us. My prayer for you is that this information is hopefully helpful and that you would tweak and adapt it for your own context, for your own situation, and that you would have fun discovering where God is guiding you and who God is calling you to be in the future. In the handout, I do have a couple of scripture passages, and these were passages that were very instrumental for us. That Isaiah 43 passage was really helpful, was a driving force for us throughout the process. And then for me personally, the Joshua passage has been one that has guided me. It can be overwhelming at times. You're going into new uncharted territory, and it can be scary. So I love the words that God gave Joshua when he was in a scary time. Be strong, be very courageous. Do not be discouraged or afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So I guess that's the end of my part, and I have a few questions, unless there are questions that we want to share from you first of all.
Thank you for that, Heather. It was, I love where you ended with the having fun part and with the idea of a dessert and dreaming night. Because I think, sometimes these processes can seem so daunting. Like, where do we even start with this? But I think even if you're a congregation not considering amalgamation, maybe you're just, wondering where God might be taking you, like the dessert and dreaming idea is just so fun. Like, even just to say to members of the congregation, look, I feel like as leaders saying, we want to have all of the ideas, what might be on your hearts, what God might be calling us to do. And so it's kind of a fun idea to do really at any stage of ministry. It's such a great idea. So thank you for all of that, but especially for ending with that place of hope and courage and a real actionable item that people can go ahead and do. And I just wanted to let everybody know that I actually did not post the handout yet, but it will be there. Sorry about that, Heather. It will be there immediately after this. I'll get communications. So once the webinar is done, it moves to a place on our website called previous webinars. And alongside the previous webinars, we post some of the handouts and the slides. So you'll be able to find that there. We had one question that did come in, actually, and it's a very good one. So the question was, what if one of the amalgamated congregations or the amalgamating congregations already has a strong identity and mission? So yes, what are some suggestions for what could happen in that instance?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of those situations perhaps where it's not an either or, but it's a both and. If that one congregation already has a strong idea and mission and vision, what can be added to that would include the joining congregation? It's hard to know how best to answer that without knowing what the other congregation is like. Is it a congregation that is perhaps, struggling to find its identity? And you don't, like we were always advised, you don't want to be swallowed up. Like, you don't want to see one congregation swallowed up by the perhaps larger, healthier congregation. You'd like both to be, to feel like they are equals in this process. So maybe there's something that the stronger congregation does well and can continue doing well, but maybe there's something that they could add to that mission, to that vision, that would incorporate the gifts of the joining congregation.
Yeah, so the person who asked the question has said that the other congregation is a struggling congregation. So there's kind of a situation where there's one with a stronger mission and vision, and then there's one that's more in the struggling phase. So,
and that's always a challenge. And I'd say we definitely were in that boat too. Cookstown was the stronger congregation for sure, and Baxter was the struggling one. But because of Baxter's location with the school and the strong children's ministry there, it brought that to the table, whereas the other brought sort of stronger finances and just the size of the congregation was larger. So I think it's discovering because you want to honor that smaller congregation, and you want to encourage them to discover their own gifts. And I would think that a program like the 12 Keys, I don't get commission for that. I'm just wondering how many times I've mentioned that. There are other ones too. I've got some of the resources listed in the handout, the missional map making, and Alan Roxburgh, he does an awful lot of work at Vancouver School of Theology. He spoke at General Assembly, I think, when it was held out in Vancouver. And he has a website that has an awful lot of wonderful, practical resources on discovering who you are, discovering your gifts, and how those gifts can match and connect with your neighborhood, with your community. So I think that struggling congregation would really benefit from doing some of that work, discovering their own gifts and how they can bring those gifts to the amalgamation, and how their gifts can be honored and complement the work that's already being done in the other congregation.
Thank you. This is a very helpful answer. I kind of was wondering, how can ministry leaders, or whether that be the session or the minister of the church, if they are feeling like amalgamation would be something that would be good for the congregation, like how does this happen? How do you begin broaching the topic? Or is it usually that things must emerge organically from a more general, like desserts and dreaming event? Or is it right to come in and say, have we considered amalgamation, like straight out of the gate? Or does the discernment process, is it best to start that in a more general way? Or is it good to have that possibility on the table right away?
So we had a situation in our presbytery not long ago that a struggling congregation came to presbytery and said to presbytery, we want you to amalgamate us with another congregation. And it didn't work. Because I really believe that in order for something to be sustainable and true and authentic, it has to come sort of from the grassroots up. But I'd be naive to say that we just have to wait for it to organically sort of present itself. There has to be some strategic planning and groundwork that is done too from the leadership. So I think when the leaders and the minister and session together, when they come to that point where they're realizing that, the current way of doing things is not sustainable, and we're not able to go forward, then that can be an opportunity to sort of strategically plan some events. Again, it depends on the context and the situation, but even exploring like approaching another congregation and saying, we have this wonderful idea that we'd like to do a prayer and praise night together, like say on a Sunday evening, and just see what that looks like. And we could partner together to plan this event. And then that sort of gives the feel of how you could possibly work together well in other ways. And then from that initial contact, perhaps a secondary follow-up event could take place, like a dessert and dreaming or a dinner or something that you have sort of strategically planned to do together. It's sort of testing the waters. It's almost like a marriage. You've got to date the person before you pop the question. And so you want to get a feel for the dynamic and the energy that would exist in doing something together with that congregation. So I think things that are fun and things that are not, heavy and deep, that you could decide to do together just to test the waters, just to explore the territory. And then after doing a couple of those events together, then you can discern, should we be taking this to the next level? Should we start to talk about engagement instead of just dating now? And then you can have some of those more serious conversations, and then starting that process of, committed members, interested members from both congregations meeting on a regular basis to explore possible amalgamation using some sort of curriculum.
Thank you. Another very helpful answer. We have a question here that I think I can answer, but it might be. So the question is, where can we get the guidelines or resources to find out what is the general process of amalgamation in relationship with Presbytery in the national office? So we actually, on the Presbyterian Church website, have a document that's called Guidelines for the Amalgamation or Dissolution of Congregations. You can find it by just searching. I'm looking at my colleague Jen, who's right here, who found it for me, but you can find it just by doing a general search on our website. But I will also actually post that along with the handout that Heather has provided, so that you will know kind of the formal process for it. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Emily. That'd be good to have that handy. I sort of find it a tad ironic that that resource is available in a larger resource that also talks about the dissolution of congregations. It's like, before we get to that point, let's back up a bit and consider this first.
Exactly. Now, that's the last. Oh no, here we go. We got another one. Woohoo, lots of questions about amalgamation. Is there an intersection between amalgamation and church planting? For example, do a few churches amalgamate with the goal of planting a new church? That's a very interesting question. I don't know. So then it's a little bit added, not an entirely new church, but a sister church. How might this fit with the cyclical PCC? So I don't know if you have any thoughts, Heather, about amalgamation and church planting, but considering Jen is here, we can make her answer that one if we want to.
Sure. Well, and really the Living Faith story is sort of that. It was amalgamation, but it was the creation of a new congregation, a new church building. So it sort of was a new church plant that grew out of the amalgamation of two dwindling congregations. Mm-hmm. I know that's not always the case, but yeah, that is sort of what it looked like for us. And Jen, you can talk more about that.
I don't know if you wanted to. Yeah. Let me see if I can get you on camera. Sure. Not expecting it.
So the cyclical PCC program is intended to help people discern a call to new church development, right? So if someone feels called to take two congregations, and basically what you're doing is a replant in that case, right? So the congregations, the formal life would cease to exist, and they would take on a new configuration and would adopt a new focus of ministry. And so that would be in line with cyclical PCC to help the leader discern a call to this type of ministry.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Let's see if we have any other questions coming in. David. Okay, this one is back to you, I think, Heather. So what are the things that the amalgamating, thank you, Jen, by the way. What are the things that the amalgamating churches should consider regarding creating a new name? Is it really necessary to have a new name? If the name changes, what paperwork is expected? Do we need a lawyer involved in that matter?
Okay, yeah, we didn't need a lawyer, but you definitely needed the involvement from the national church. And first of all, it went to Presbytery with the approval of the new name, and then to the national church. And so all of those sort of legal changes, I think, were done at the national church level. I know we definitely didn't need to get a lawyer involved. But yeah, things did need to get changed. We kept the same congregational code as the Cookstown congregation, and then the Baxter code was just retired, I guess. And you know, things like letterhead and stuff like that had to be changed, and a lot of communication and sort of getting the new name out there. But what we went through when we were going through the process and learning from different consultants, they did stress that a new name really formed this new ministry, that one church wasn't feeling like it was being sort of absorbed by the other church, but both felt like they had equal sort of standing in the new congregation, and that you were doing something really new. And that was defined and that was made visible through the creation of a new name.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if you have any more information. about the legalities around that at the national church level?
I don't know, actually. We can look into it and get back to the person who asked the question if that might be a helpful way of going about that. Yes. Okay, so David is saying that he's having a bit of audio trouble, but I'm still able to hear you, Heather, so he's gonna come back.
Okay, and I just realized I had 2 more slides. Those just had some questions, and it had a list of the resources that might be helpful that I make mention to.
Okay, we don't see your slides anymore on the screen. We actually see.
Yeah, because I took them down. Here, I can put them back up again.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, and the questions that I basically had were the ones that were helpful for us in the dessert and dreaming night. These were the types of questions we asked, like dream about what you do really well. And, that might be some information that would help that question there with the, the larger congregation that has a strong vision and the other one that might be joining that is a little bit less defined in their vision. These types of questions help. And so just discuss together, what is it that you do really well? What's the greatest struggle that you're facing right now? And, chances are it's financial or it's something to do with the building or whatever. And then these are the community outreach questions. Consider your community. What are its greatest needs? And then what's one way your congregation could creatively meet that need? And then through the answering of that may be the way that you discover your mission, your vision going forward.
Thank you. Those are helpful questions. We had another question about who is a good person to come and meet with a group of congregations to help guide them through this kind of process. Because you had mentioned that you had gotten a couple of consultants in or people to kind of help along the way. How is it best to find those people? I mean, in many ways, if from a Canadian Ministries perspective, you could definitely be in contact. Well, with the Presbytery probably would be your first contact the Presbytery to see if there are resources there. But you could also we would be open to you contacting us in Canadian Ministries. But how did you, Heather, find those people?
So it was exactly that. Keith Boyer was the Synod congregational consultant at that time for our Synod. So that's why we contacted him, and he came in and did a couple workshops with us. And then Neil Mathers, we contacted him because from our presbytery, and we knew that his Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, which is where he was at that time, he's now retired, it was an amalgamated congregation that built a new church. So very much going through a process that we were just starting on. So we learned from him what worked, what didn't, what to avoid. And again, like anything, people can share their experiences, but it's not a cookie cutter process. You really can't take what worked with one congregation and think that's just going to drop into your situation and you're going to go through the process without any hiccups. You really have to take that information and adapt it and make it your own and tweak it to your context. So that's what we did with Neil. And we also visited some other congregations, St. John's Presbyterian in Bradford. It wasn't an amalgamation, but they built a new church. So we visited their church to just get some ideas for what we could do, what was possible for us. So I think just finding out through presbytery and through the national church, who has already done this and what can we learn from them? And since that time, since we've gone through it, I've spoken and our former ministers spoken at different presbyteries too, just to say, this is what worked for us, and take what you can from our situation and adapt it for yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one last question that I will answer actually is, any thoughts on strategic planning across denominations? So in a webinar that's happening in January, I can't remember the exact date, we will be having a discussion about ecumenical shared ministries. And so what that looks like to bring together congregations from different denominations, and which denominations, we'll be discussing which denominations we have those agreements with to be able to do that. So that will be coming up. This is a little advertisement for joining us for the webinars, the upcoming webinars, in which we'll continue to discuss more ministry configurations that might be helpful for congregations seeking different like alternatives to what they're currently living as a small congregation. And even if you're not a small congregation, maybe just looking for a different model of ministry, you feel God calling you to something else. And as always, I just want to say that we're happy to receive emails and calls from people across the country here in Canadian ministries. If you're looking for more resources about this or names of people to talk to, we can definitely network and make some contacts for you in that regard. But we've reached 2 o'clock, actually it's 2:01. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Heather. Heather, we really appreciate your leadership of this webinar, and we will be praying for you in your new call, and also be praying for Living Faith Community Presbyterian Church. And we're just so happy with what God has done for you and for that ministry. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Emily, for organizing this. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thank you. And until next time, everybody, join us for some future webinars. It'd be great to see you. Thank you. I'm going to sign off now.
Thanks.